often I run across somebody who says, but, doc, I was addicted, but I had a really happy childhood, and then that's when I issue what I call the happy childhood challenge. It takes about 3 minutes of conversation, just asking a very few basic questions. And like you said, you have these trick questions that you ask people. Well, I have my own bag of tricks as well. And that happy childhood story never stands up to any kind of scrutiny, and it's really important that it doesn't, because otherwise people blame themselves. Mm-hmm. I had this, one of the saddest letters I received. I mentioned this in The Myth of Normal. There was a guy in Seattle who read my book on addiction, in which I point out and argue that addiction is a response to trauma, and particularly trauma incurred in childhood. And he writes back, he wrote me a letter saying, I found your book very interesting, but I can't blame my mother. I'm a because of myself.
Yeah.
I just felt so bad for the guy.
Yeah.
Because he didn't get it. First of all, he didn't blame his mother. I don't blame parents at all. Parents do their best. It's just that his mother, like maybe I as a parent and perhaps you as a parent, our best wasn't good enough.
Yeah.
Because at that time we still haven't worked out stuff. Mm-hmm. But there's no blame in recognizing that. But more than that, in that statement that I'm a because of me, he was expressing such self-loathing and self-rejection, which are the hallmarks of trauma.
Yeah.
But with that mind, that's the world he lives in which he is worthless.
Yeah.
And that mind was created by his childhood, but he can't see it.
Yeah, it's so true. I recently had this insight about myself as well, because I had a father and a stepfather who were very disapproving, very judgmental. I was never good enough. My stepfather would say when I said, Dad, I got, 98 on my test. He's like, what happened to the other 2 points? And he wasn't kidding.
Yeah.
And I think that left me with a sense of lack and void that I was trying to fill and always trying to be seen and known and acknowledged. And it's sort of, I've actually built a career on that, and it worked, but now I'm sort of reorganizing all that in my mind and what matters and how I want to live and how I relate to my work and other people and the need for validation. And I never, if you would have said, Mark, do you love yourself? I was, of course I do. Do you have high self-esteem? Yes, I do. Do you have a lot of self-worth? Of course I do. But the truth was, I don't think I really did.
Well, you did based on external conditions.
Yeah. I was like, I really didn't. Yeah. And I've really been cultivating.
Yeah, I'm the same way.
That level of self-worth and self-love. And I actually went to a retreat for myself. I wanted to sort of lock myself away for a month, and I went to Vermont and I just stayed in a cabin. I pulled out all the distractions, phone, computer, books, TV, nothing. And I just sat with myself, and I walked, and I, ate, and I was in nature, and I wrote. That was one thing I did do. And I was just sort of amazed to sort of begin to realize that I was enough. Like those, and I had this feeling. It was after this work around my mother and this trauma that I began to kind of have this insight about what was driving me and driving my behavior that, had a lot of good results, but that actually left me not feeling that great, and also sacrificing my health and doing all kinds of things that weren't in service of, my soul and what really mattered.
Yeah.
And I was like, it was such a shock. And a friend of mine said, like, you don't love yourself. You don't have self-worth. I'm like, what do you mean? Like, of course I do. But I realized I didn't.
No,
and the cultivation of that has really changed my whole internal architecture.
Yeah. Yeah. It was, for me, and of course, the way the society works is, as you pointed out a couple of times in this conversation, it rewards us for our self-betrayal.
Yeah.
And so that I was this respected doctor, always available, and he's so kind and all this. And my wife would go into a supermarket and they see the credit card and, are you the wife of the great so-and-so? And she would grit her teeth.
Yeah.
Because the great
at home.
Because the great so-and-so wasn't available at home. Yeah. He was too busy working all the time. Wasn't available for his own kids, for his own self-care, for the relationship, But the world externally rewards us for that. So as much as it grinds some people down, it elevates some people for the wrong reasons, and for reasons that which then reinforces. And it's very addictive, because if my value depends on how much I'm helping others, it becomes addictive. And the reason it becomes addictive is because there's always a niggling doubt inside, which is maybe unconscious, but says, okay, they want me, but do they want me or do they want what I'm giving them?
Yeah.
So that satisfaction of getting that praise and valuation from the outside is a temporary hit, like somebody's temporary hit from heroin.
Yeah.
And then you have to have it again and again and again.
And our culture rewards that. I mean, it doesn't reward
and
addiction.
Our culture rewards it. So our culture rewards that kind of addiction big time, values it and esteems it. Meanwhile, the soul is being ground to dust inside.
Yeah.
And that's that's another example of the myth of normal.
Yeah. It's so true. I think, and it's, the stories we tell ourselves are often so distorted. And, one of my closest friends, I thought for 20 years he'd had a happy childhood, because he always said he had a happy childhood. And it wasn't until I went away and did a workshop with his sister. We were at the same place. And I started sharing about this, and she's like, "What are you talking about? My mother was crazy, and she did this and she did that, and it was awful." And I'm like, "What?" And it was a shock, and it explains so much about his behavior and his patterns, and I think a lot of us do that. We kind of prematurely transcend, in a way, our trauma, and instead of actually going through it, we try to go past it and end up having all these maladaptive patterns of living and being and not functioning in a way that brings us joy and happiness and peace, which is what we're all after anyway.
And as you mentioned earlier, then you go to a physician, and I've often done this in talks that I give. I ask people, well, if you've been to a cardiologist or a respirologist or an oncologist or a dermatologist or a neurologist, any kind of an ologist in the last 5 years, just raise your hands. So, out of 500 people in the room, half of them at least will put their hands up, maybe more. And then I'll say, now keep your hands up if they ask you about any childhood trauma, your current relationship, any stresses at work, how do you feel about yourself as a human being? The hands mostly go down. And yet I say to people, and I say this with full scientific backing, that those questions that are not being asked are what drove you to that doctor in the first place. Whether that trauma manifested in chronic physical illness or mental health conditions or addictions, that's the source. And unless you deal with that source, you're only dealing with symptomatology and not actual cause.
So for people listening, they're probably wondering, wow, maybe I haven't identified this or that as trauma, or maybe actually I did survive a really traumatic childhood I'm aware of. But I'm stuck in these dysfunctional patterns, and I don't know how to break through. I don't know how to rewire. And how do we kind of reconstitute ourselves in this modern world? It's a toxic culture, because so if we all got to go off and live in a monastery somewhere, it might be okay. But how do we do that? How do you provide a path for people to think about their own healing?
Well, it's very difficult, because partly it's a matter of resources. Like those that are fortunate enough economically to be able to afford a good therapist, and I have to emphasize good, because there's a lot of really useless therapies out there. I could talk at great length about that don't go to the heart of the things, but you only deal with the surface. So if you can afford to do that, by all means, just as you take your car in for a tune-up, take yourself in for a tune-up, and find out what is grinding and what is not working, and where it's not lubricated, and what actually happened. There's lots of therapeutic modalities, and I've developed one. You mentioned that in your introduction, compassionate inquiry, but I don't claim it's a panacea.
What is that?
Well, at this point, I'm only mentioning it as one possible amongst many, many others. There are so many forms of therapy out there, and people can find whatever works for them. So there's my compassion inquiry. There's my good friend Dick Schwartz's internal family systems, which is getting increasing traction and attention for good reason. There is Peter Levine's somatic experiencing.
So body-based therapies.
Body-based therapies, that's right. The craniosacral work, body work such as massages and so on. And very interesting how many times people will get a massage and the therapist will touch a certain part of their body, and all of a sudden the tears come. You know, because like Bessel van der Kolk says in his best-selling book, the body does keep the score. The body keeps the score. So the sensory motor therapies, Pat Ogden, I could name many therapies. But if you're going to find a therapy, find one that's trauma informed. Most therapies are not trauma informed. Something like cognitive behavioral therapy mostly deal with, I'm not saying it's categorically, but mostly deals with the surface of things. It doesn't deal with the underlying traumatic template for why you think the way you do. Also, but for people who can't afford a private therapist, well, or the community programs, there's all kinds of information about trauma. Many of my talks have been uploaded to YouTube, not by me, but just by others on trauma. You can get lots of information, not just from me, but from others as well. There are modalities that anybody can do, such as meditation and mindfulness. Like you spent a month on your own, and basically, I've done similar things where you're just alone with your mind.
Yeah,
and
that's a scary thing.
It can be a very scary thing for sure. But that means taking a break from the digital world. Yeah. Actually spending time alone with the mind, and then writing about it, journaling about it, talking to people about it. There's lots of stuff that people can do, and increasingly there are more and more books that are really good guides to understanding and working with trauma. Peter Levine's work, Waking the Tiger, In an Unspoken Voice, that's another one of Peter's work. My various books that you were kind enough to mention, including this most recent one, Bessel's The Body Keeps the Score, Bruce Perry and Oprah's recent book called What Happened to You, about childhood trauma. And memoirs like Educated by Tara Westover, which is quite a wake-up call about trauma and its impacts. So there's lots of stuff out there now. At least we're living in a world where this conversation, although it's not penetrating the medical profession very much, at least it's happening out there in the world.
Yeah, it's true. And I think, historically, illness was seen as a spiritual problem. In most cultures. You mentioned Lakota, when someone's sick, they bring the community together, and the shamans and the medicine men were the healers, and there was no division between, spirituality and disease and health. It was all one continuum. And I spent, a lot of time in very interesting cultures when I was in medical school. One was a Hopi reservation, and another was in Nepal, and there was this embedded culture of shamanism and medicine men and healers, and I remember being up in mountains and way in the remote areas near Tibet in Nepal. We were on a medical expedition, and the Dami Jankris were the Nepalese healers, and there was this incredible ceremony with the whole community around and the ill person. It wasn't like you went to the doctor and you went and sat in an office by yourself. Like the whole community was there. That's right. And the healer was there working on the person, and they were doing whatever they were doing, but activating, different healing mechanisms of the body that we actually can activate through these various different modalities. And many cultures historically have used plant medicines to actually heal. And now with the advent of this field of psychedelic assisted therapy, this whole conversation is changing. In fact, the psychedelics, and we've had Michael Paul on the podcast, Tony Bossis and others who are doing this work, and they really have sort of resurrected this body of research that started in the 50s around psychedelics and LSD to look at how we can use these to help heal the mind. And I know you sort of work with this model as well as part of the modalities. And like you said, there are many, but for many people, this can be an interruption in their normal view of themselves and their world and create safety. And I members of my own family who've been able to take advantage of this and actually start to find peace and start to kind of unpack the sort of traumas. And I have many friends and many colleagues who've used this, and a lot of it's sort of underground now, but it's really emerging. And whether it's ketamine therapy, whether it's MDMA, psilocybin therapy, whether it's ayahuasca or ibogaine, which is incredibly interesting to me as an an addiction treatment. And we want to sort of talk about that a little bit. And even things like stellate ganglion blocks, which are a nerve block in the neck that interrupts the fight or flight response. These are all technologies, let's call them ancient technologies, some more modern technologies that actually seem to help people sort of take a quantum jump over and leapfrog over a lot of the sort of slogging through the traumas through traditional therapy and traditional psychiatry and medication, which often doesn't really work that well.
Well, I wonder if you had, like myself, often wished or not often wished that if we could just combine the amazing achievements of modern medicine with some humility to look at the traditional wisdoms, teachings of indigenous peoples, because it's not a question of one over the other, but boy, if we had that kind of wisdom infused into our technological minds, we would be so much more powerful as healers. And as you suggested, the illness is not just as a biological event, but as a psychological, spiritual event. So the medicine wheel of North American indigenous people, which the four quadrants of mind and spirit and body and sociality all have to be balanced. And as regards psychedelics, so my third to last chapter in this book is on psychedelics, and because I have worked with them quite a bit, and I spoke with Michael Pollan and I asked him if he was surprised by the success of his book, How to Change Your Mind, and he said what he was most surprised was that he expected a lot more pushback. Within the medical profession, but he says people are realizing how thin our toolkit actually is, and then we have to find some other solutions. And I myself have found, both individually for me, but also as a healing modality for people I work with, psychedelics to be a very powerful potential, and more than a potential, is a very powerful modality. And I'm not a psychedelic evangelist. I don't think psychedelics are going to save the world or save medicine, but boy, are we nuts not to explore them and to employ them, because they have so much to potentially to offer in so many conditions. And in the book I give examples of people healing not just from mental health but also from physical conditions, based on changing their mindset as it flows from psychedelic experience.
So Gabor, how do these medicines work? And I think they're all different, right? But how do they reset these neural networks, and how do they help people metabolize their trauma and heal it? Some traditions,
like for example with ayahuasca, it wasn't necessarily the client who would take the plant, but the shaman would. And the shaman would then get a vision and deep insight. And I've worked with these indigenous shamans in the Peruvian rainforest. Let me tell you, they're penetrating.
The Shibobo healers.
Yeah, the Shibobo healers, they're deep. And they see things that Western medicine just hasn't got a clue about. I'm talking personally, I had that experience.
Yeah, can you share that?
Yeah, and they just saw right into me. They had no idea who I was. They were not impressed.
They hadn't read all your books?
They didn't read my books. They were not impressed with my credentials. They just saw this human being carrying a lot of trauma. And they just saw it. And they worked with it. So, and I didn't have to be on the plant for them to see that. I was, but it was their own vision that allowed them to see that. So that's the first point. Is that partly it has to do with who's administering it and what context and what training they've had.
Yeah, the set and setting, they call it.
The set and
just go to a party
the intention
and take the stuff
and the context. Secondly, Sigmund Freud once said that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious, meaning that in dreams we manifest some of our most unconscious emotional dynamics, which is true, but the interpretation of dreams is notoriously difficult, and I think Freud certainly had his own delusions when it came to interpreting other people's dreams. But I think psychedelics might be said to be a royal road to the unconscious, because they remove the usual defenses of the egoic mind. So you get to see both the pain and the possibility that underlies the egoic mindset. So people get in touch with some deep agony sometimes. They also get in touch with some beauty that they had not been in touch with, but they've been inside them all along. So you get to see both the traumatized, unprotected, uncovered, traumatized aspect of your personality that's been pulling the strings behind the curtains for a long time now. But you also get to see the possibilities of oneness and unity and love and beauty, so that you don't have to keep running. You don't have to keep employing these defenses.
Yeah.
That's it in a very small nutshell, but the potential is tremendous, and I've seen it happen. I've experienced some of it myself, and I've certainly seen it happen a lot in my work with other people.
Yeah, I think it's very powerful. And the sort of addiction space is sort of fascinating because, not all psychedelics or plant medicines are the same. And this particular compound, which I don't think we've talked about on the podcast, ibogaine, derived from the iboga tree.
Yeah, one of the things I wish I talked about in this chapter, but I didn't, and I'm not even sure why I omitted it. I was probably just want to get the book finished.
There's only 4,000 pages already.
Was iboga, because iboga, which is a plant that grows in Gabon by the retreat people,
Africa.
and it's been used as a spiritual enzyme, you might say, by those people. They're tribally speaking, but it's got the amazing quality of not just of unearthing traumatic imprints like many of the other psychedelics do, but also in the case of opiates, actually obviating opiate withdrawal. So you could be on heroin for 20 years, and after 2 nights of iboga or ibogaine, which is the extract, you are not going through withdrawal symptoms.
Which is shocking from a medical perspective. Well, an alcoholic, I worked in the emergency room and someone come in with alcohol withdrawal. It's a physiological phenomena. Heroin addiction is and withdrawal is a physiological phenomena. So how do you interrupt that?
Well, opiate withdrawal is terrible. The dependence because of the loss of opiate receptors, and therefore all of a sudden you don't get the opiate from the outside. Your system is in total shock. Ibogaine prevents that. Now, again, it's not for everybody. There's some medical contraindications, and the context has to be really right and pristine, both psychologically and medically and physically. But in the proper hands, it's transformative. And there's studies being done now with American veterans with PTSD, showing amazing results with using iboga. Stanford is running such a study. But of course, in the wisdom of our current society, it's illegal and it's considered to be medically useless. And therefore, it's hard to even get permission to study it. Which is
there is a woman
to the highest degree.
There's a woman who's spoken to, and I've heard her speak, Deborah Mash, who's a scientist, has worked with NIH-funded studies and has done a lot of the key work in this area of iboga, and it talks about the development of derivatives of iboga, like noribogaine and other derivatives that actually may not have some of the adverse effects, but can kind of benefit people. And we've actually had conversations about food addiction. You mentioned sugar being the most addictive compound in the world.
Right.
I think, I've talked about it in my books that, rats will work 8 times harder to get sugar than to get cocaine. If they're already addicted to cocaine, they'll switch over to sugar. And and I sort of had said, hey, maybe, I don't know if this is, anybody even looked at this, but wouldn't it be interesting if a lot of the sort of maladies we have now, which are related to food, which are driven by food addiction, could be treated with this plant medicine? It would be kind of a fascinating line of inquiry.
And what does that make Kellogg's with their sugar frosted flakes, or Coca-Cola?
Drug pushers.
They make them, they're the biggest drug pushers in the world. And yet, they're respectable brand name companies, and talk about the myth of normal.
It's true. I mean, the first podcast I ever did is Doctor's Pharmacy with Michael Moss on sugar, salt, and fat, and he documented the ways in which the food industry deliberately created addictive foods. They have taste institutes. They hire craving experts to create the bliss point of food.
I know, and if one of my patients in the downtown east side got caught with an ounce of cocaine that he might have trying to sell to feed his own illegal habit, and I could talk at length about why these habits are illegal and others are not. But if one of my clients got caught with an ounce of cocaine, he'd go to jail. And these corporations They kill millions.
Oh, yeah.
And they're just respectable citizens and respectable entities. You know, I mean, the absurdity of it and the injustice of it just cries to the heavens.
It's true. You know, addiction will kill, let's say, 70,000 people overdose in America. Guns, maybe 70,000, probably 700,000 die in America.
100,000 last year, more than 100,000 last year.
Yeah, but still, I mean, still like 7 or maybe 10 times that are caused by food.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and yet we don't really have
course.
a national conversation about this.
Yeah.
Even with COVID, you know, where diet plays such a huge role in predisposing people to hospitalizations and death, it still isn't part of the national narrative. I mean, in other countries it is now, but
and again, COVID, I mean, we used to say in the beginning, we're all in this together. No, we're not. People that are of color, people that are poor, people that are driven by stress into obesity, these people are at significantly higher risk than people that were more privileged. So, no, we're not all in this together. In this society, we're all in this together is a real lie, is what it is.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, I find it really, you know, despite the depressing nature of this conversation, I actually find it very hopeful because, you know, when you kind of identify and name a problem, and you understand the root causes of it, and you can map out a series of strategies to help treat the problem, is actually very reassuring. And
well, you know what? So in the last chapter, I talk about the values of disillusionment, and it's really good to be disillusioned. Like I ask people, would you rather be illusioned or disillusioned? Would you rather believe in a false universe that doesn't actually exist? Or would you rather see things the way they are, so you can do something about it? So I wouldn't have written this book if I saw no possibility, if I saw no redemption, if I didn't see the healing capacity within individuals or even within society. So in that sense, you might call me an optimist.
Yeah.
But I do think that in order to get there, we really have to look at how things are unflinchingly and not pretend to ourselves that what we think is normal is actually normal. It isn't.
It's not. No, that's the myth of normal. I mean, and in a way, it's a book of redemption. It's like, how do we redeem ourselves from a toxic culture, from toxic families, from a toxic environment, and how do we heal that? And that's a conversation that's so invisible that hasn't been brought forth by many doctors. I think, you know, you're one of the few.
Well, as physicians, we're not trained to do that, and we're trained actually to look away from it. And you know, there was one study on physicians, actually on residents, medical residents, without going into the details. When they looked at markers of biological aging, they aged faster than other people their age, which has to do with the tremendous stress and trauma that physicians are ground through in order to make it. And so that they have to ignore their own stuff, their own stress and their own trauma in order to be successful. Then when they get out there to practice, that's the last thing they think about.
That's true. I mean, I remember being told by residents who were older than me, basically as we were in rotations, like basically lunch and sleep were weaknesses, you know? And I'm like, what?
Yeah, I was 50 years old when I found out that you can actually sit down to have lunch. You know? You don't have to do it running between offices.
That's true. This is such a good conversation. I have a few more things I want to sort of dive into. One is the biology of psychology.
Yeah.
You know, Carol Mace talks about how our biography becomes our biology.
Yeah.
I mean, our biology also can become our biography, right? So physical things can cause mental illness, but also psychological stresses can cause physical illness. And, you know, Candace Pert, you talk about in your book, I had the chance to meet her, who worked for the NIH and studied the mind-body effect. She called it body-mind and the molecules of emotion. And, you know, can you explore a little bit about the science behind how these traumas and these psychological stresses manifest in the body as physical illness? So
here's let me begin with the frustrating thing. So, in 1860s, Jean-Marie Charcot, the father of modern neurology, who first described multiple sclerosis, said that it was caused by long-term vexation and grief. William Osler, a great physician at Johns Hopkins, one of the founding physicians at Johns Hopkins, he said rheumatoid arthritis was caused by long-term stress.
He also said that it's more important to know the person who has a disease than the disease the person has.
Itself. That's right. Yeah. An American surgeon called Paget wrote about breast cancer that had a lot to do with depression and so on. So that in 1938 there was a Hungarian American physician at Harvard called Soma Weiss, who was so revered that there's still a research day in his honor at Harvard to this day. And he said in a lecture to a medical school class,
another Hungarian Jew,
published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, he said that mental and emotional factors are as important in the causation of illness as physiological ones, and have to be at least as important in the treatment.
Yeah.
In 1977, the great American physician and psychiatrist George Engel called for a biopsychosocial approach, which recognizes that biology is inseparable from our psychological dynamics and social relationships. So,
not new.
So this is nothing new. Now, what is new is that these great pioneers, what they recognized intuitively, now we have proven by means of hard science. So in terms of hard science, the body and the mind can't be separated.
No.
That the emotional centers in the brain are connected with the nervous system, with the hormonal apparatus, with the immune system, with the gut, and with the heart. In other words, they're not even connected, because even to say connected creates the impression that separate entities are somehow wired together.
Right.
These are not separate. They're the one system.
Yeah, one system.
They're just as Candace Pert called it, the body-mind. It's one system. Therefore, it just stands to reason that whatever happens emotionally will have its manifestation physiologically. And sure enough, when people get emotionally stressed, that's not just a psychological event. Their hormonal apparatus goes into gear. They secrete stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline. Now here's an interesting little fact. When you go to a dermatologist for inflammation of the skin, or a rheumatologist, inflammation of the joints, or a neurologist for inflammation of the intestines, or a respirologist for inflammation of your lungs, and I could go on, what medicine are you going to get? You're going to get some analog of cortisol, which is the stress hormone. Now you think as physicians we might ask ourselves, gosh, we're treating everything with stress hormones. Could stress have something to do with the onset of these conditions? Maybe just, perhaps.
Yeah.
And of course, the research is indubitable that that's actually the case.
Yeah.
And the physiological pathways have to do with these connections. That what happens emotionally affects the immune system. That what happens, or what happens in the immune system can actually affect the emotions.
Yeah.
So if you get a viral infection, that can release hormones from the white blood cells that will make you depressed.
Yeah, when I had COVID, I was so depressed, and I'm never really depressed like that. And I was like, I understand why people want to kill themselves.
Yeah. So
I knew it was COVID, but I was like, holy cow.
Yeah. So it goes both ways. So it's not just the physiology. So because it's one unit and it's one system, it's inevitable that whatever happens emotionally is going to show up physiologically. Furthermore, we know that childhood trauma elevates the circulation of inflammatory particles in the blood, cytokines so-called, which can turn on cancer genes, which can reduce the body's defenses, which can support the growth of blood vessels to support tumors, so on. We know that stress, even in utero, if your mother experiences stress, that will show up in your physiology at age 45.
Yeah.
By mechanisms I write about in the book, but I won't go into now. But in other words, it's just this constant dance between our psychological lives and our physiology, and it's unscientific to ignore it. And I've only mentioned a few mechanisms. Then there's the impact of stress and emotions on the functioning of our genes, which is studied by epigenetics. Or one could go just on and on and on.
Yeah, microbiome, your bacteria are listening to your thoughts. Your immune cells are listening to your thoughts. Your telomeres, like you said, your genes.
And one study I looked at was stress on the mother during pregnancy will interfere with the infant's microbiome.
Yeah.
So it's just so that these dynamics are inseparable and inextricable. They're just a unit. And once we understand this is a scientific fact. So when our profession talks about scientific medicine and evidence-based medicine, if there was one phrase I could delete from the medical lexicon, it would be evidence-based. Because I only wish that we were evidence-based.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I often say, we're reimbursement-based, not evidence-based. We do what we get paid to do, not what the right thing to do is, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the flaws. And a lot of the evidence is ignored because it's not large randomized clinical trials, which are only one form of evidence.
Which is one form of evidence, and mostly to the benefit of the pharmaceutical companies.
Exactly. And then population studies are another form of evidence, but again, those don't necessarily prove cause and effect.
And you know what's another form of evidence? I know I'm heretical to say so. Just listen to people's stories. Let them tell you about their lives. That's evidence.
Exactly. Absolutely.
It's only not evidence to the people who are terminally cut off from their heart.
Well, I think the advent of systems biology, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and quantified self metrics, which are how we measure our own biology, are going to revolutionize the way we understand all of this. Because it's not too far in the future that we're going to be able to plant a chip in our skin and come up with everything that's happening in our body and have it read by some supercomputer and make sense of all these connections and patterns and see how it works. But it's so true. And I think, the thing that you mentioned that I want to dive a little bit deeper into is this concept of epigenetics. And for people listening, just a little background, your genes are fixed. You can edit them maybe with CRISPR and these new technologies, but basically you've got 20,000 genes. You've got a lot of variations in those genes, but those genes are regulated by something called the epigenome, which sits on top of your genes. And those epigenetic marks, let's call them, like bookmarks in your book of life, which is your genome, determine which pages get read, which genes get read. And that determines your health or determines what diseases you're going to get. And what's really striking to me, and there's some interesting literature around the Holocaust, which you were in many ways sort of a representative of the trauma from that generation, is that generational trauma is real. It's not just an abstract idea, but the biblical idea that the sins of the fathers are visited upon their sons. I mean, there's actually scientific evidence now that we know how our imprinting in our grandparents or their grandparents is transmitted generationally through these little tags or bookmarks on our genes that determine what happens to us. So can you talk about that and what we know about how that works and what we can do about it? Can you change those marks?
So it's a very interesting new field, a relatively new field, epigenetics, as you say, on top of genes. I'm certainly no expert on it, but I did interview people who are. Moshe Sif in Montreal and Dr. Rachel Yehuda at Mount Sinai, actually, in New York. And these people have done elegant research that show exactly what you're talking about, that experiences in life can change how genes are turned on and off by the environment. And those effects can be transmitted into new generations without any change in genetic structure.
Yeah.
And there's this tremendous misbelief in the power of genes in the general public and certainly in the medical profession. There are very few genetic diseases. Yeah. There's very few genetic diseases that if you have the gene, you're going to get a disease. One runs in my family, muscular dystrophy. If you got that gene, you're going to have the disease through the generations. And that's shown up in every generation of my family. That's very rare.
It's like 1%.
1% maybe, or less.
Less, right.
Huntington's chorea, things that. Already when it comes to breast cancer, for example, everybody talks about being genetic. No, it isn't. Out of 100 women with breast cancer, 7 have the gene. And out of 100 women with the gene, not all of them will get the disease.
Exactly.
In other words, the genes themselves, even in the case of breast cancer, like Angelina Jolie very famously had mastectomies and oophorectomies. Their ovaries were taken out. And she did made a calculated decision because an aggressive form of that gene runs in her family. And so I understand that. But that's very rare. Comparatively speaking. And so in most illnesses, the genetic effect, if any, is minimal and not at all decisive. And what is decisive is how the environment acts